Friends, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you today to celebrate the life and shared legacy of Andrew Carnegie. It is my first visit to the Peace Palace as Secretary General of the Organization of American States. I consider it a genuine honor to stand within these walls and talk about the promotion and maintenance of peace in the Americas. The inter-American system has been constantly evolving for over a century. In its current iteration, the Organization of American States is the foremost political forum of the Western Hemisphere. Throughout this evolution, its core motivation and purpose have remained the same: the attainment and maintenance of peace and prosperity in the region. The Organization of American States, as it is today, is guided by a founding charter that recognizes democracy as indispensable for the stability, peace, and development of the region. It is grounded in a commitment to good neighborliness and solidarity, identifying the rule of law as a necessary condition for security and peace. This building in which we have gathered is dedicated to those very same principles and beliefs. The post-colonial history of the Americas is marked by a series of collaborative international efforts that have been continually building towards this goal. We see this illustrated in the plethora of arbitration treaties to address sensitive cross-border issues, including boundary disputes, by the frequent declarations against the right of conquest and in favor of the condemnation of war, and a commitment to seeking out nonviolent means to resolve disputes between our countries through the mechanism established and mandated under international law. Our history is marked by numerous congresses and conferences, all convened to create and strengthen the economic, social, and cultural ties of the region, and in turn, further continental cooperation, solidarity, and brotherhood. One can see the impact of this initiative by simply comparing the maps of Latin America to those of Europe as they developed over the course of the 20th century. Through two world wars, the deterioration of state powers and ethnic divisions caused European nations to witness constant territorial shifts. New borders were carved across old lands. Mighty nations enveloped weaker, smaller states, while in some cases new countries emerged within old ones. In contrast, the Americas stand as a model of stability and solidarity. There have been remarkably sparse changes to our borders, let alone cases of cross-border violence or overt intercontinental conflict. In situations where disagreements arise, Latin American states have demonstrated clear willingness to pursue dialogue and seek out international mediation to resolve their disputes. In many ways, I attribute this tradition to the mediation and peace-building initiatives underpinning the inter-American system. We have proudly built regional mechanisms to address the challenges of our hemisphere, be it through the Pact of Bogotá, the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. When these instruments and institutions have been unable to resolve the challenges before them, there has been a willingness, time again, employ the global international institutions that were designed to address these very challenges. The Carnegie Peace Palace is a testament to this tradition. It is at the International Court of Justice where countries of our hemisphere have not only sought resolution to border disputes and interstate conflicts, but also return to resolve their disagreements with those resolutions. It was a little over a year ago it became apparent that the scale of abuse and human rights violations perpetrated in Venezuela amounted to crimes against humanity. During the violent demonstrations of spring and summer of 2017, my third report on the situation of Venezuela stated that there was evidence pointing to the systematic, tactical, and strategic use of murder, imprisonment, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence as tools to terrorize the people of Venezuela. In July 2017, I appointed former ICC prosecutor Luis Moreno Campo as a special advisor to help define and launch an impartial and independent process that could allow the OAS to gather information on the situation to assess whether crimes against humanity had been committed in Venezuela. In May 2018, the panel of independent experts released their report indicating there are reasonable grounds that satisfy the burden of proof required by Article 53 of the Rome Statute to believe that crimes against humanity had in fact taken place in Venezuela. Shortly after that, I formally submitted the report to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, requesting that the prosecutor open a full investigation on an urgent basis. In the months since, we have been working diligently to identify a coalition of countries from the region to invoke Article 14 of the Rome Statute and formally refer the situation in Venezuela to the ICC. We are close. We are optimistic that very soon we will see a historic and clear voice from the Americas stating that they have chosen to support the path of international law and recognize that in this case, a global response is necessary to stop the legitimate use of force and aggression against civilians. The international community must speak in a loud and clear voice to say that impunity in Venezuela must come to an end. These countries are assuming their responsibility to protect the citizens of Venezuela from the terror of the dictatorship running in the country. If we want to be genuine in our pursuit of peace, then we must be willing to stop the violence and conflict where it begins and before it takes hold. We must be able to stop rogue regimes and prevent drug traffickers from interfering with and taking over our governments. This requires the political will and commitment of decision makers, of those who hold the levers of power and control the monopoly on the use of force, to always put the interest of their citizens first, because violence and instability is not no one's interest. Close to 3 years ago, I spoke publicly of my concerns about the deterioration of the democratic process in Venezuela. In the months following, we proceeded to track and document the assault on the country's democratic institutions while they dismantled, co-opted, and corrupted, and the government caused a man-made humanitarian crisis of a scale not seen in our region through corruption and incompetence. I clearly condemned the growing pattern of abuses, calling on the international community to help resolve the developing crisis in Venezuela. There was no political will to act. Abuses against democracy and human rights cannot be hidden by misguided rationalization of internal jurisdiction, especially because the protection of democracy and human rights is not a matter exclusively of the internal jurisdiction of the member states. In claiming non-intervention, the international community shirked their responsibility and chose to support the status quo. As the Maduro regime lost their support of their people, it declared its citizens the enemy and chose a path of oppression and fear. It designed a state policy of repression implementing a widespread and systematic pattern of arbitrary detention, torture, and violence against anyone who might disagree with them. It weaponized the humanitarian crisis, depriving innocent civilians of food and essential medicines, causing countless deaths and forcing the largest migration crisis this hemisphere has seen. More than 12,000 Venezuelans have been arbitrarily detained, that we know of. More than 131 killed in protest and on government orders. More than 8,000 extrajudicial killings. More than 1,300 political prisoners incarcerated. Detainees are tortured and abused, in some cases subjected to rape and other forms of sexual violence, operating as if by formula, following a consistent and using systematic tactics. This is what the evidence we collected clearly shows. More than 2.5 million Venezuelans have fled the country in the past 3 years, and every day do so thousands more. It is estimated that another 1.5 million will leave in the next year. That is more than 10% of the population forced out of their homes, searching for their survival. The consequences of Venezuela's collapse are already felt well beyond its borders. The situation in Venezuela now threatens the peace, stability, and security of its neighboring countries. In the pursuit of peace, we must ask the question, when is the time to act? If we consider the greatest tragedy of our lifetime, when was the time to act? In Rwanda, was it after 100 deaths, after 1,000, after 10,000? When was the moment to stop Pol Pot? If we want to achieve peace, we must be willing to act before we are counting the dead. To achieve peace, we must be willing to use every measure available to prevent violence and conflict and stop it when it begins. We must be unequivocal in our condemnation of the illegality of armed attack, invasion, or aggression. Let me be clear, every action must be taken with the confines of international law. Invoking Article 14 of the Rome Statute would be an important and essential step in bringing an end to impunity and gaining justice for all of humanity. We cannot confuse the notion of peace. You cannot achieve meaningful peace through the use of force and coercion. It is not peace when thousands are dead or in jail and millions are fleeing the country. This is the kind of peace that Maduro dictatorship is installing. The peace that we seek for Venezuela is one that arises from social cohesion, from inclusive economic institutions, and from democratic political governance. There is no sustainable peace without a strong democracy, without respect for the rule of law, and without protection for human rights. Although it is the most acute, the challenges to peace in the Americas are not limited to the atrocities in Venezuela. The daily challenges facing the Western Hemisphere are not those of interstate conflict or open war. Yet, we cannot boast that we are a peaceful region, for it is not war that threatens our countries, but the consequences of corruption, weak rule of law, and insufficient social development. Corruption is a disease in our societies that progressively undermines the trust of citizens in their governments, weakening their stability and undermining economic development. Democratic institutions are weakened to extend the hold on power after popular will has shifted. Our cities have the highest rate of violence in the world, caused by organized crime and the narcotics, trade gangs, trafficking of persons, terrorism, and other forms of organized crime. Increasingly, we are falling victim to natural disasters and the consequences of climate change. The real path to peace comes from tackling these issues at their onset. We must be willing to act before there is a death toll and before we are preparing contingencies for the countless who have lost their homes, their livelihoods, and their families. It is to this end that the Inter-American system is working on a conceptual framework to address these contemporary problems and threats to peace and security in the region before they are allowed to become a crisis, in order to prevent and escalate them in a more comprehensive manner. This examination has ensured an ongoing dialogue and open political debate on the need for a multidimensional approach to security, which replaces the traditional thinking of security as territorial integrity with a new concept where human beings are placed at the center of security concerns. This is why I established the Department for the Promotion of Peace within the General Secretariat of the Organization of American States. This new unit will strengthen our capacity to promote and deepen this essential and ongoing dialogue. Today, I'm here to sign a Memorandum of Understanding between the OAS and the Carnegie Foundation as one of the first initiatives of this department. Together, we will engage in a comprehensive effort at partnering for peace with like-minded organizations through the development and implementation of joint programs on conflict prevention and peace building. The two buildings that house our institution, the Peace Palace and the House of the Americas, have a shared history that reflects this very goal. They were erected thanks to the generosity of and as part of the legacy of Andrew Carnegie. Both serve as symbols of of his visionary quest for universal peace and prosperity for all mankind. Today, we are witness to another important step forward in realizing Carnegie's dream through this new partnership between the Carnegie Foundation and the Organization of American States. Peace is hard work. It is too easy and too often that our leaders fall into the traps of power and greed. Long-term stability, security, and prosperity are an uphill battle, which in turn requires a long-term investment. Oppression and repression, be it domestic or international driven, are the biggest sources of armed conflict. The preamble of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights clearly states that whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Promoting and sustaining peace is a demanding task that involves a concerted effort from all sectors of society. It also requires the staunch support and action of the global community, a constructive, vigorous, and participatory process to successfully foster dialogue for resolving conflicts within a framework of a culture of peace and can only be created through cooperation and seeking common ground. In other words, it entails a more proactive role in conflict prevention and resolution. Time and again, the world has shown how easy it is to look the other way in the face of tragedy, to choose the status quo over action. Time and again, the world has shown, through brutal experience, that the cost of conflict surpasses immeasurably the cost of peace. It is my hope that through the creation of mechanisms such as the one that will be established today, that will be able to prevent the tragedy of another Venezuela, be it in our hemisphere or elsewhere in the world. To paraphrase the esteemed Nobel Peace Laureate and former President of Costa Rica, Oscar Arias, the international community must begin to show the difference between those who invest in life and those who invest in death and violence. I look forward to continue working with the Carnegie Foundation and with all of you here today so that together we can continue to build on Andrew Carnegie's inspirational international legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. We've got a couple of minutes just to chat a little bit further. This memorandum of understanding that you're going to be signing, you mentioned it in broad terms there. We were going to try and project it up on the screen for everybody, but it was decided that the density of the prose would not sit well to be read in this sort of environment. So can you just give us a sense of what, practically you're pledging to do here and why it's so important to you?
The most important thing is to...
Yes, can we raise the volume? Yes, keep speaking, Your Excellency.
Okay.
Yeah.
The most important thing that we're establishing here is a grounds for coordination and to share knowledge and to share experiences and to pick up good practices and to eradicate bad practices. The knowledge of international law, of course, is the most important tool that we have in order to preserve peace. And so, working together on this field, working together, bringing this knowledge of international law into the political arena, into the international relations in the hemispheric, definitely is a very important tool for us in order to preserve us out of the conflicts of the continent.
And what are good practices and what are bad?
Okay, we have mentioned some of them in our presentation. Bad practices are often related to those mechanisms that you find about oppression and repression in the continent. Bad practices within the democratic system or the political system in the continent. Bad practices about the promotion and respect of human rights. When those things are not addressed properly by the states, when you don't have enough guarantees in order to preserve access to justice equity before justice, when you don't have guarantees to make in order to confront a political system, when the political system has, or the executive power, for example, has co-opted the judiciary, when the parliament is blocked, then all these things create an environment that is bringing us out of peace. Plus, of course, the bacteriological diseases that we have in our systems. The biggest one being corruption. The second one is a lack of dialogue. Usually we have an equation in our political system that 50% plus one vote equals 100%, and 50% minus one vote equals 0. And that is not a political equation that is possible in order to resolve most of the cohesion that we need in our societies.
We've been discussing here for the last 3 days the relevance of Andrew Carnegie's legacy, which was 100 years ago in a very different world then, the relevance of that to the problems that we face today in the 21st century. Where do you feel that his continued importance, or the continued importance of his legacy, lies for the Americas?
Well, first of all, I owe him my office, and that is, the most beautiful building that exists in Washington. But having that office, having that building, it means a lot. He was one of these precursors of multilateralism. He wanted to create this multilateralism and hold it for the Americas. And that's why support for the Pan-American Union and the closest ancestor to the Organization of American States definitely is a landmark of what of an approach that brought, I think, most of what we just mentioned. That the map of Latin American countries, of the countries in the Americas, have hardly changed in the past, let's say, 100 years. And also at the same time, this knowledge, there is a phrase that was very important. It was to build when the fundamental stone for that building was planted. Then it was said that it was to eradicate ignorance, the ignorance that we have of each other in the continent. And I think that we see it here in this building, and that definitely was the attempt to build in the Americas a closer relation between countries based on knowing better each other.
Right, thank you. I wonder if there's anybody who has a question in the audience. I think we might avoid Venezuela, which we've covered very fully in the speech. Yes, young gentleman at the end there. Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind just giving us your name and where you're from.
Yeah, sure. Buenos días. I'm Leonardo Parraga from Colombia. And I'm very interested about the role and support of OAS in the Colombian peace process. And now that we're transitioning to a new phase after signing the peace agreement, one of the things I'm wondering is what's the strategy of OAS to address the inclusion of youth in this new phase, and also when it comes to the dialogues with the ELN going on in Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Inclusion of youth, Your Excellency.
Yes. First of all, our support to the peace process has many years, and we have walked a long way in Colombia and helped to support many governments in Colombia and many different phases of that peace process. Inclusion is an imperative of the agreement, and for youth, especially for youth, but also at different social levels. Colombia faces serious challenges about that. The most dramatic one is to eradicate the violence and crimes and pressure and threats on social environmental activists as well as youth activists. So that is something that definitely we need to address during this time. I think the process is going in a new phase where reality is marking what has to be done. Reality is most of the time has the sign of pesos, you know, because budget is something that, of course, makes these programs and projects possible or not. We keep working on at the same level and denouncing what is going wrong through the process and trying to bring stability and security in the process. We are the organization that has more people on the ground and the territory of Colombia. Maybe, of course, less than the church, but more or less the same that the Red Cross. And that is a permanent presence in practically all the territories that were left behind by FARC. That were those territories where the biggest pressure is on it, because when guerrilla or abandon a territory, these territories under bigger pressure of organized crime and of course the challenges that may come of criminalization of the society that lives there.
Can I ask,
Yes.
do you as an organization, do you have a strategy for involving more young people, more women,
Yes.
more voices at the grassroots?
Yes, that is. We are doing that. The map definitely is a good paradigm for that. Most of the people that are working with us in MAP OEA in Colombia are young people, and equality of gender is an imperative of the mission. It's also an imperative of the organization. It doesn't work so easy because any time that we ask for a recommendation from a member state, we ask for youth and women, and mostly what we get are men and old. So it's something that we are...
Well, do you turn them down then?
Yeah, if you have, I don't have a permanent vocation. I don't have a permanent vocation about offending people, but that it happens just time to time, believe it or not. So it's something that, yeah, we have done a lot of affirmative action, and we'll keep doing affirmative action about youth and gender equality. But it's something that you need to fight hard to achieve it.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. Question there, and then.
Richard Millett, Carnegie Foundation for Ethics and International Relations. First of all, I want to express our deep appreciation for your efforts to defend the Inter-American Democratic Charter. But as you know all too well, in the Americas, efforts to deal with governments which govern undemocratically, which abuse their own population, have consistently clashed with the Latin concept of sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. Are we making any progress in dealing with that contradiction? How do we resolve that basic dilemma?
Yes. If you see, we have made some substantial progress in the past years. And even if you consider the words of the Charter of the Organization of American States and of course the wording of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, it is, and of course the human rights conventions that we have in the continent, it is very clear that the protection of democracy and human rights is not exclusively a matter of internal jurisdiction of the member states. What we have seen about the Inter-American Democratic Charter, it is that it was much easier in the past, of course, to apply it to a small country where an evident coup d'etat has happened than to apply it to a big country where the deterioration and bad practices of democracy brings to the rupture of the democratic order. Venezuela has been a case about that, of course, because it was practically the first time that the democratic charter was applied to a big country, a pivotal country like Venezuela. And it was clear that the democracy, it has to be helped, assisted, and built also from outside when necessary. And the resolution of the 3rd of April 2017, declaring the alteration of the constitutional order in Venezuela and the rupture of the democratic system, was a clear step forward about that. The resolution of this year of the General Assembly declaring the legitimacy of the Venezuelan elections is another step forward that we have made. So today, if we see practically no one in the continent except Venezuela and maybe 2 more, they are not insistent about sovereignty and non-intervention when we are talking about democracy and human rights. So this is, I think, it has been a substantial advances in the past years.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hello, my name is Candice Ali Hussein. I'm from the Peace Palace Library in the Carnegie Foundation. I have 2 questions. Recently, aside from the human rights situation in Venezuela, experts have also expressed concern about Nicaragua, perhaps going down a similar path. Given that you're also a lawyer, I was wondering if military actions would be necessary in the future, what would be a legal basis for that? And perhaps you can maybe say something about Article 19 in the OAS Charter. And also my second question, what can the OAS do in concrete terms for refugees in the region? Thank you.
Well, there's a few things to tackle there.
Yes.
If I can ask you to be relatively brief, if you wouldn't mind, we'll just try and get a couple more questions in.
I will try. Yes, it seems a lot that Daniel Ortega is ready to jump the same cliff where Maduro jumped before. And that is our main concern. Because we feel that still we have sometimes, we are just on time to make him reverse. But I was much more confident about that, let's say, 3 months ago that I am now.
Is there any legal basis for military action?
Look, I don't, military action, it has to be according to law. We, as I said in my speech, we condemn any form of illegal armed attack, invasion, or military intervention. That has to be clear. We have to be clear about. But of course, we cannot deny the people of Venezuela or the people of Nicaragua tomorrow to some basic rights that they have according to international law, containing, for example, the responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention. But responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention also has a lot of diplomatic ways to develop before reaching that point. So that is very, very last resource has to be done according to international law, but after exhausting practically every single measure that may exist in order to prevent that. If we always try to find, we need to find, and the tools of the Inter-American system, you have mentioned an article, and mainly a way of democracy to democracy and a way of peace to peace. So we need to attached to that, and we have to be very adamant in defending those principles.
And a brief word on what the OAS can do for refugees?
You know, it's trying to make the countries sensitive. When I was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uruguay, we engaged in some global issues, like we brought to our country some Syrian refugees, just because we were sensitive about their situation and their lives in camps. We need to be sensitive today about the Venezuelans leaving the country. We have here the biggest crisis ever, the biggest exodus that the continent have ever seen. The thing is, the other day I was asked if we can, not the other day, it was yesterday, in fact, if we should implement refugee camps in Latin America and for the Venezuelans. And I said that it should be the last resource of all of them, because once you have people in camps and once they have the status of refugees, it is very difficult to move them from those camps and very difficult to move them to other countries where they can be received. So I think for the crisis that we are facing in the continent today, I really value a lot what Latin American countries are doing, because they keep absorbing Venezuelans, no matter what. If we see European Union absorb 2 million Syrians, and it was a big challenge, we are above that for Venezuelans, and we keep absorbing them. Our countries keep absorbing them, and in a natural way, in a natural manner. Of course, all their services, health services, security, education, are under great stress, but so far we try to keep responding under their normality, under these normal conditions that we want to prevail to address this case.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry to race you around such hugely complex and knotty problems so very quickly, but thank you very much for addressing our questions. I'd like now to invite Eric Debatz to sign the Memorandum of Understanding.
Have a short signature.
If you allow me,
You want to speak?
if you allow
Okay.
me a few words indeed. I think an important part of the words of the Secretary General addressed some bad practices. The content of this MOU notably focuses on the best practices, because there are inspiring examples, and that's what we do during these Carnegie peace-building conversations, to also bring about the best practices. We learned in our encounters with the Organization of American States that at the border of Guatemala and Belize, youth and children are in processes of getting to know each other better understanding, promoting peace. And that is what we as Carnegie Foundation are here to, promoting peace, and of course the facilitation of international law. Not so much the Rome Statute, that's done elsewhere at the International Criminal Court, but here, of course, we work indeed on the rule of law. We find peace through law crucial, and we much relate to the multilateral system to prevent conflicts from happening. And the inspiring examples that take place in the OAS, we gladly work with the OAS to give them more of a platform.
Thank you very much. We're going to have a break for coffee now, and after that we're going to hear, we were talking about the role of youth there, we're going to consider the vital role of next generation peace builders. So please join me in thanking His Excellency Luis Almagro and Eric de Baets for their contribution here.